I'm Daniel Brooks, and welcome to Zev's Bible History Podcast. This is episode 4 of our tithing series. If you've been with us from the beginning, you've seen how we've traced tithing from the law of Moses, through Israel's disobedience and prophetic warnings, and into the radical generosity of the early church. Today, we're turning our focus to one of the most controversial aspects of this topic: how modern churches handle tithing. Joining me again for this important discussion is Mark Ellis. Is it biblical to teach tithing today? Are we mixing Old Covenant law with New Covenant grace?
This is where things get real, Daniel. A lot of believers feel guilt, confusion, and even spiritual manipulation when it comes to giving. And it often traces back to one thing: the way tithing is taught in churches today.
Let's just say it up front. There's a lot of pressure in some churches. You'll hear things like, "You're robbing God if you don't tithe," or "God won't bless you if you're not faithful with your 10%.
Exactly, and most of those teachings come from Malachi chapter 3. It's used like a spiritual hammer. But we've already seen in episode 2 that Malachi was written to Israel under the Old Covenant, not the church under the New.
Right. And the promise in Malachi, "Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, and see if I won't open the windows of heaven," was connected to their national covenant. It was about agricultural blessing, not financial wealth.
But today, that verse is often twisted into a prosperity formula. Give 10%, and God will multiply your income. It turns giving into a transaction rather than an act of worship.
Let's be honest. Some pastors sincerely believe they're teaching biblical truth, but others use it as a tool to keep their budget afloat.
Yes, and that's where spiritual abuse can creep in. When giving is tied to guilt or fear, it ceases to be grace-based. It becomes legalism in disguise.
Let's take a closer look at the common tactics used to justify New Testament tithing today. What's the first one that comes to mind?
Well, the Abraham argument. People say tithing came before the law because Abraham gave a tenth to Melchizedek. We touched on it in episode 3. The idea is that since it predates the Mosaic law, it must still apply.
But as we said, that was a one-time gift. Abraham wasn't following a command, and there's no record of him tithing again.
Exactly. It wasn't systematic or required. And Hebrews 7, which references that event, doesn't command tithing. It uses it to show Jesus' priesthood is superior to Levi's, not to reinforce the tithe.
Another tactic is the "Jesus said to tithe" claim, based on Matthew 23.
Yes, and again, context matters. Jesus was rebuking Pharisees who were still under the law. He never told his disciples or the early church to tithe.
Let's talk about how this gets into people's hearts. What happens when believers hear these teachings week after week?
They begin to associate their relationship with God with their financial giving. It becomes, if I tithe, God will bless me. If I don't, he'll curse me. That's not New Covenant thinking. That's fear-driven religion.
And that's why so many people feel conflicted. They want to be generous, but they also feel burdened and confused.
Exactly. That's why we have to recenter the conversation on grace. Paul said in Galatians 5:1, "For freedom, Christ has set us free." That includes freedom from the tithe law.
So what should pastors be teaching instead?
They should teach generosity, stewardship, and spirit-led giving. Paul gives a clear model in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. Giving is a grace, not a tax.
Let's look at that in more detail. Paul was raising support for the saints in Jerusalem, and he says the Macedonians gave beyond their means, of their own accord.
Yes, and they gave joyfully, even in poverty. Paul doesn't mention a percentage. He highlights their heart.
This is a big one. Paul even says he's not commanding them, but testing the sincerity of their love.
Exactly, and that's where modern teaching falls short. When churches command a tithe, they remove the chance for believers to respond freely out of love.
And what about supporting the local church? Some say, well, pastors need to be paid. We need a building. So tithing keeps the church going.
Yes, And we do need to support our local fellowships. Paul says in 1 Timothy 5:17 that elders who labor in teaching are worthy of double honor. And in 1 Corinthians 9, he says those who preach the gospel should make their living by the gospel.
So financial support for ministry is biblical, but the method matters.
Exactly. It should come from joyful, willing hearts, not pressure or tradition.
Let's talk about testimonies. A lot of people will say, I started tithing and God blessed me. How do we process that?
Great question. God often blesses obedience, but that doesn't mean the theology behind it is correct. If someone gives generously, even under a flawed understanding, God can still honor the heart. But we must move toward truth.
So we're not saying giving is bad. We're saying the way it's framed needs to change.
Exactly. The goal isn't to give less, it's to give biblically.
And biblically means free, joyful, generous, and led by the Spirit.
Yes. And it's not about how much you give, it's about how much love is behind it.
Let's summarize some harmful results of mandatory tithing teachings.
Sure. First, it can lead to guilt and shame for those who genuinely can't afford 10%. Second, that can create pride in those who think their tithe makes them righteous. Third, it can distort our view of God, turning him into a divine banker who only blesses if we pay up.
That's so powerful. And on a practical level, it often leads to resentment or burnout. People give out of obligation, not joy.
Exactly, and when giving becomes a chore, it's no longer worship.
So what's the solution?
Teach the truth, show people the joy of grace-based giving, encourage prayerful personal decision-making, provide accountability, but not pressure, and remind them that their worth is not tied to their wallet.
Beautifully said. We need a return to biblical generosity, not a recycled version of the Mosaic Law.
That's the heart of it.
Well, that wraps up episode 4 of Zev's Bible History podcast. If this series has helped you rethink tithing and grow in your understanding of Scripture, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone you care about.
We'll be back next time to answer some of the most frequently asked questions about tithing, like, what if my church requires it? Or, can I give my time instead of money? You won't want to miss it.
See you in episode 5.